Hello, everyone. My name is Ashraf. I am the founder of Debug Academy, a locally based, primarily Drupal training company. We're pleased and honored to be given the opportunity to be a core sponsor for an event like this, which helps expand and grow the Drupal community, which of course is something we're passionate about. If you yourself are looking to get into Drupal development, please come by our booth. If you're looking to expand your team through training or hiring extra developers, we're a great resource for that. And we're happy to set up pipelines with different companies to continually bring in new Drupal talent to your team. I'm also very pleased that I get to introduce Jeff Eden. Kirsten, one of the organizers, is our link. I'm actually the last person to train her in Drupal, and he was the first to train her in Drupal. So that was a pretty cool discovery. She encouraged me to introduce him because, as I was already aware, he's a very well-known, well-renowned speaker and content strategy expert in Drupal. One of Drupal's core strengths over other technologies is its ability to handle content modeling in a highly structured, consistent way from site to site. And Jeff is going to help enlighten us all as to how to do that in the best way to get the most out of Drupal. So here's Jeff.
Well, thank you. That is a spectacular introduction, and hopefully we'll all have fun with this, because honestly, what could possibly be more fun than content modeling? Yeah. I get to wear my nerd cap for this one. Anyways, yeah, I'm Eaton. I work for a company called Lullabot, and we do a lot of work on sites and projects with lots of content. I think one of the things that is distinctive and interesting to me about a lot of the projects that we've worked on over the past probably decade or so. I didn't have gray hair when I started Drupal. No direct correlation, just time. Is that a lot of the projects that we work on, content is actually a core part of an organization's mission. It's not just, sort of their marketing work that they do on the side or something like that. It's really the heart of providing information to the public, educational resources, or publishing and entertainment. That's really sort of the common link that pulls together a lot of the stuff that we work on, and I enjoy it a lot. And what we're going to be talking about today is how to actually improve the process of planning and modeling the content that we build. And to that end, I'm going to start with one of my favorite stories. Jorge Borges is an Argentinian writer. He wrote a story called On Exactitude in Science, about a nation of cartographers who they mastered the art of cartography, and this was their obsession. And they built maps at such a large scale that an entire city would be taken up by a map of a province, and an entire province would be taken up by a map of their empire, and that was not enough. Eventually, they moved on and built one-to-one maps of everything, so that the entire empire was covered by a map of the empire. And the punchline to that is that the next generation, their children, decided that this was a pointless and useless exercise and just left it to the ravages of time, and all of their maps just sort of were taken away by the elements. And the final line of the story, I think, it really rings true to anyone, I think, who has tried to manage content for a large project and passed that on to another team or other individuals. It's in the deserts of the West still today, there are the tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. And I'm pretty sure that's exactly where I found the documentation for a couple of projects that I had worked on. But we're going to talk about why that is the case, why that happens, and what we can do to avoid it. I mean, we talk about content a lot, especially, Drupal is a content management system. But one of the reasons it's such a hot and growing topic in tech and digital publishing and web projects is because it's the basic building block of almost every web or digital project we do. It's all about communication, and communication requires content, meaning that has been crafted by humans for other humans and gets passed around to convey messages. And because we're building digital systems to do that, and because there's pressure to make a lot of it and to become more and more efficient in what we do with the content we make, the need to actually carefully plan out the structures and the relationships and everything between those different types of things, between the different kinds of content that we're making, becomes a more and more critical part of every one of the projects that we're working on. As time went on from the old days of making HTML pages, or home pages as we called them back in the day, who here actually had webmaster in their title at some point? Yeah, making all the HTML pages. We moved on to where we started using, databases and management systems to store more structure than just, boom, an HTML page. And then slowly but surely we started thinking about how we could tease apart those records into different types of things that had different properties, like a page versus a blog post with categories and tags instead of just where it is on the website. And then that extends to lots of other types of stuff that we work with now. An e-commerce site, a media-oriented site. All these different kinds of things are in a large part defined by the kinds of materials that are being published on them, their unique properties, how they interrelate to each other. And today, a lot of projects that we work on, especially Drupal sites, there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a lot of different types of content. There's a lot of different connections between them that we use to drive how the site works, how it behaves, what people see, where things appear. And that takes planning. It takes a clear and consistent understanding of what all of this content is so that we can go and build it and have it actually work by the time we're done building it. But that also raises, especially in larger organizations, some difficult questions, particularly who should be in charge of that? Who is actually responsible in an organization for deciding what is the content that we have? What are its properties? What does it mean? How, what is the canonical view of our stuff? And in a lot of organizations, that's a difficult thing to come by. You can say, oh, well, we know literally what we are storing in the database right now. But often, that's not really what the organization's content is. Over time, it may have evolved in a different direction, and people are actually using the blog post page for press releases, which is kind of a different thing conceptually, or they've hijacked the event page to be something else entirely. I think William Gibson's book, Neuromancer, has a line in which it says the street finds its own use for things. And yeah, anybody who hasn't put hard and fast rules around different fields in their CMS has discovered just exactly what kinds of zany uses people will come up with for the different structures in the average CMS. But then even if we iron out between all of the different departments or different people and teams who's supposed to figure this stuff out and who's the final authority, there's still a question of whether or not anyone will actually understand the documentation that we produce. Will it actually be possible to convey meaning with what we figured out? Or is it just going to be a couple of people over in a corner trying to plan this stuff out, and they create a spreadsheet and then they sigh and they go on to other parts of the project? And I'll say, even if that works, even if there's a completely shared understanding that everyone has of what content we have, how it works, how it clicks together, how will we keep it up to date? What if it changes? What if it evolves over time? Well, this is also my favorite example of language problems. Even if we think we're all speaking the same language, it's very easy for an organization to, without realizing it, convey the wrong messages because different teams are using language in very different ways. For those who can't read it, this is something I actually found in my grocery store while looking for food for my cats. It's 4 cans of cat food. The flavors listed are turkey, chicken, duck, and kitten. Now, take it in isolation. They all make perfect sense. But when you put them together, there are some troubling messages that are being conveyed. And that's that's a perfect example to me of why the language that we use as teams to talk about what we're doing and what we're creating makes sense. Because it's very easy for us to trip ourselves up when we're talking back and forth about this stuff, when we're planning, etc., if we don't pay a lot of attention to what kind of language we're building. And then, as I was saying earlier, the question that follows that is how do we keep it up to date? Even if we all get on the same page, even if we say, no, what we list on the can is the flavor, not the target audience for the cat food, what if it changes over time? What if it evolves? What if, 5 months from now, a new project starts and we have to start doing something differently? How will we know to keep everything up to date? I like to think of these 3 sort of, connected problems as territory. Like, that can be teams, departments, different individuals or different projects, anything that, creates those barriers of understanding and practice where different people in different areas may not have the complete picture and could have different understandings of the whole from each other. And then language, how we actually communicate with each other about this stuff, and then time, or entropy, the natural tendency of everything to change and decay over time and become less accurate. Any documentation that we create for a content model or whatever sort of has a half-life of, how long it's really good for before we have to start looking back and saying, is this still how we're actually doing things? And these 3 hurdles are what I'm going to be talking about today. How we overcome them, how we understand them, and how we can sort of find a good way forward for planning and using content and communicating with each other about it despite these 3 problems. Territory, I think, is where a lot of us get stuck. And it's where a lot of work happens in the average project. And we're going to talk about that first. Has anybody ever made something that looks roughly like this on a whiteboard when planning out content? If you haven't, man, this is fun stuff. This is my happy place. This is basically a sort of classic, let's write the name of each kind of content we make on a Post-it, slap them on a whiteboard, and just start drawing lines between them to figure out how they connect to each other. I love making these because you can put them on a wall, you can get a bunch of people into a room, they shout out the names of content types, you draw on, everybody feels productive, you're accomplishing things, it's awesome. By the end of the day, you step back and take a photo and you share it with stakeholders and yeah. Motion, movement, activity, yes, progress. And for a long time, this was really where the meat of a lot of planning for structured content happened. We still needed to dive in and do things like, what fields are there and stuff like that. But getting a bunch of people in a room, talking about what are the things you make, how do they connect to each other, what do you use them for, that was ground zero. And often, I would end up producing, documents, something like this, to try to, tidy things up and show them to stakeholders and document what we had figured out or decided on. It's cool, happy, productive day, lots of whiteboarding. A good day always involves a whiteboard with me. And in a document like this, what could be wrong? we now have our content model. But what I found was interesting is when I started talking to other teams inside of organizations, or even other Drupal developers, or other disciplines inside of the broader, web sphere, what they produced when they said, oh, we're going to figure out the content model, looked radically different. I think on one project, this is what someone handed to me when they said, oh yes, we've got the content model already figured out. A gigantic spreadsheet with a different tab for each different type of content and a meticulous list of every single field and all of its properties. And, so, okay, well, that's a different way of looking at the same stuff. It's still accurate. It makes sense. And I could say, it's not quite as, let's say, stakeholder friendly. You can't just, put this spreadsheet in front of somebody who's asking, so have we figured it out yet? But it's still got a lot of useful information. In a lot of ways, it even captured stuff that, my diagrams, didn't. They weren't as detailed, and this captured a lot of that. So it was good, useful. And then what really blew my mind was when I started talking to a UX design team, and they told me this was their content model. I said, no, my friends. This is not a content model. This is a wireframe. But they said, well, no, we've got one of these for each different type of content. And this is how we know what kind of stuff each content has, and how they connect to each other. There's, links back and forth between them. And that, I had to think about that. There was, that felt like I stumbled onto a genuine, religious, this was a theological issue that we may have to iron out. But over time, I grew to accept that they were figuring out, even if the visual representation they made wasn't something that I would in any way call a content model, they were using this to figure out a lot of the same stuff I was figuring out with my Post-its and, lines and whiteboards, diagrams. And they were even spotting things that I wasn't. They were recognizing needs and edge cases in how the content was being used as they approached it with this from this direction that I wasn't spotting in my pure sort of platonic diagram of our content. So it was useful, and that's good. So maybe there's 3 ways of doing the content model. But the problem is there were still differences. There were still weird, places where they didn't quite match up. And often what we found was we were working with clients who may have had all of these different things floating around, and they kept asking, but which one is the real content model? Which one really, actually is the model? Because, we need to know before we build it. Which one are we building from? And that was a question that plagued me for a long time. And I kept trying to come up with, what is the ultimate visualization diagram that will somehow capture all of this? Maybe I could make a new piece of software, because obviously the solution to any human problem is a new piece of software. And I started thinking about it maybe about a year ago from a slightly different angle. Has anybody ever been to downtown Chicago? Does anyone recognize the Bean? This is a giant sculpture. It's not called the Bean, but everyone calls it the Bean. It's a cool sculpture that's really like an iconic part of downtown Chicago, the waterfront and everything. And for anybody who's in the city, seeing this image, bam, it's Chicago. Just like, the Statue of Liberty is, obviously you're in New York or something like that. But what really is Chicago? What is the correct representation of the city of Chicago? How would you explain, or convey Chicago to someone? This is an obvious example. This is a perfect map of Chicago. It is literally a giant space photograph of the city of Chicago. You cannot get more accurate than that. But at the same time, I think, we all know there's other ways to look at the same thing. This is census data. This is, as of 2010, this is how many people are living in what areas around Chicago. This is a traditional street map. You know, in the days before we just used Google Maps for everything, you would unfold one of these and, you know, try not to crash and, you know, figure out where you were going. This is a map of CTA rail lines, you know, Chicago's, you know, train system. That's a map of excellent sandwiches in the city of Chicago and where you can find them, which I dare say is even more useful than some of the other maps if what you need is a sandwich. This is a map of blocks affected by the Chicago fire. It's not very helpful if you're trying to get from one point to another, but if what you're looking at is the impact of natural disasters on a particular space, this is the literal most accurate representation of what you need to figure out. This is tunnels underneath the city of Chicago as of 1908. So time is another, you know, factor in there. And as I started thinking, looking at maps and cartography and these different kinds of views of a space as sort of an analogy to the problems I was trying to suss out with content modeling, what really started sinking in was that maps are useful because they show important things, not because they show every single thing. Because there's not really any way a single map could show every bit of truth about a place. It's just that's not how visual things work. In geometry, there's a shape called a tesseract. It's like the four-dimensional analog of a cube, and where you've got like you look at a line, a square, a cube, and then there's a tesseract, which is some people talk about it being like a cube in time or something like that. But the real thing is there's just no good way to convey a tesseract in one snapshot. It defies that kind of representation. And any image you get of a tesseract, by definition, is a moment in time. It is a choice about what view of the tesseract you're going to capture and convey. And the true thing, the actual tesseractness of that tesseract, is more nuanced than any one of those individual snapshots. Which brings us back to content modeling. Rather than asking which content model is the official content model, which one is the canonical one or the, quote, most accurate one, I started thinking more and more about the question, what angle are we looking at this from? What are we asking about our content for this document that I'm producing to actually answer? Am I trying to tell a database engineer what tables and columns he has to make? Am I trying to tell a member of the editorial team what stuff they're going to need to plan to produce over the next 2 months in order to, you know, be ready for the launch? Am I trying to tell a stakeholder, here's the big picture of how all of your assets that you're producing fit together? You know, those are all very different questions, and they have different representations. And they're conveying different aspects of the content model, which in a lot of ways is bigger than any of those individual documents I was creating or trying to use. So what I settled on is a sort of kind of a broad definition, but what I settled on was the idea that the goal of content modeling and what any given content model document or artifact is supposed to accomplish is shared understanding between all the people on team and clear, consistent answers to questions about the content. Now, clear, you know, it should be something that, you know, everybody who's participating in the conversation can actually understand. And consistent is the other thing there. You know, if you ask the question, you know, today, you should be able to rely on the fact that the answer is probably going to be the same tomorrow, and it's not just going to drift around based on, you know, what someone's producing. And there's a lot of different aspects of that. The kinds of questions that we ask, the kinds of questions that we need to be able to answer cover a lot of ground. I'm going to go through just a couple of them real quick. The first one, and this is probably fairly obvious for anybody who's tried to plan out content types on a Drupal site. What content types do I need? What fields do I need to add to them? The first and most basic question that we need to be able to answer is, what kinds of content do we make and manage? What, purposes do they have? Stuff like that. And how do they relate to each other? An article has comments, a product has reviews, an event has a location, and locations have rooms. Those kinds of things, how they interrelate to each other is a big part of, the model and its structures. The other thing is, what individual properties make up each one of those different kinds of content? What rules govern them? What properties always have to be there? How long are titles? Is it just, could someone put an entire article into the title? I don't know. That's a question. On some websites, that is actually allowed. I think it's a terrible idea. But for some people, conceptually, it makes sense. And then where do they come from? When we're making this stuff, who's actually producing it? Is it imported from a third party? Do we actually have a team of people who log into the CMS and type stuff out? Where are we getting this stuff? How is it organized? Do we have a giant tree structure that people browse through, the tree of life in biology? I think Drupal's taxonomy module, one of the original developers for it, way back in the day, was actually someone working on a biology project for, I think, the University of Iowa. It's oh, well, of course, that makes sense. You've got a giant taxonomy of life, so you made a taxonomy module for Drupal. But those ideas of how we organize and present things to the people who are looking at our content and trying to find stuff, but also how we organize it and present it on the back end for editors and the users who manage it on a day in and day out basis. Those may require different ways of organizing and presenting things depending on the needs of the site or the needs of the organization. Another question that impacts and has a serious impact on the model that we're creating is what processes does this content go through? How does it get developed? When does it go from some emails that people are kicking around to an actual thing that exists in the CMS? Some organizations, we worked with a news organization that actually wanted the CMS to capture even just the pitch for any piece of news and track it from the initial idea through rough drafts to editorial processes to final publishing. Others say, that happens somewhere else. That's in IMs and emails and Microsoft Word, and then when it's ready, boom, it goes into the CMS. But these kinds of questions about the processes that it goes through also have a big impact on the content model because, well, do we have different states that something can exist in? Do we capture that? Do we know when it should be live to the public, when only editors should see it? These kinds of organizational processes, the things that are more in the content strategy and planning and business processes kind of stuff, they directly impact the content model. Even if it's in tiny ways, they have a big hit on how well it actually fits what the needs are. What people and roles are responsible for the content throughout its life cycle. Are there editors, are there lawyers who review things? Are there stakeholders who have to approve stuff? Are there photo editors that have to do treatments for stories before they actually go live? Stuff like that. And then finally, what goals are we trying to accomplish with the content? What measurements are we using to determine whether or not we're actually making the progress and accomplishing the things that we wanted to? This covers a lot of ground. I've basically described content strategy here. Figuring out all of these questions is a lot of work. And I don't want to imply that content modeling, planning out your content types and their relationships and stuff like that, is in and of itself such an expansive task that it is the totality of the work that you will be doing, but rather it's directly impacted by all of these things. And making the content model isn't one of the tasks that occurs before you can go build out the content types in the CMS or something like that. It's a reflection of your organization and your team's understanding of all of these questions. And the degree to which the concrete stuff you build in the CMS accurately reflects all of the needs that you have, well, that's the content model's job, making sure that those things match up. And again, no one document captures it all. No one team in your organization probably has the answers to that. And that's where we get to that territory thing. It's difficult. This is a difficult nut to crack because everybody has different sort of pieces of the big picture. And that's actually where I found those different kinds of documents and different kinds of artifacts that these different teams were producing to be really, really useful. And that's one of the things that I think before starting projects can be very, very handy. Looking at the work of content modeling not just as a march towards a particular diagram, but a process of trying to pull in all of the work that other people are doing that may be captured in lots of different and highly varied diagrams or documents. I think the obvious one, those charts that I would make, that I would call the content model, technically they weren't content models, they were entity relationship diagrams. In software development, that's a pretty standard kind of thing. You define the entities that your system has, what their relationships are to each other, and you draw lots of lines and you use crow's foot notation to mark things up and stuff like that. And these are really great for just capturing things like what type of stuff do we have, sort of what clusters and groups do they form into by purpose. What are the explicit relationships between them and stuff like that? Sometimes, depending on how detailed it is, you can have important properties on them. In other situations, that the sort of spreadsheet view of things is another one that may be around there, and that's traditionally in like database engineering, that's the data dictionary for a system. And both of them capture different things and visualize it in different ways. Have you ever worked with a team that created user personas? In the UX and design world, these are fairly common. The idea is you capture like a representative name like Bob the business person, or Sally the saleswoman, or something like that, and you use them to suss out what the needs or the questions are that the different kinds of people will experience when they come to the site. But there's a lot of knowledge that's actually captured in there that's highly relevant to the content model. Things like what if some of our users have accessibility needs that we didn't anticipate? That may actually be reflected in the content model, the need to provide language localization or alternate text or transcripts or things like that. These can help remind people of the need for those kinds of things. Things like content ownership, different navigational needs. Sometimes different kinds of users are coming at the site with different expectations, and providing different ways of finding stuff for them is useful. Now, that's not something that just looking at the content in the sort of platonic, perfect, ideal form that I liked to when we were up there whiteboarding would necessarily reveal. And these kinds of tools began helping me approach it from other angles, looking at it through other teams' tools, or even just taking documentation they had produced using these methods, helped me spot problems in the perfect model I was making by looking at it from other angles. Even those visual wireframes helped me a lot because it helped me recognize things like priority and emphasis decisions that designers were capturing that in some situations might need to be reflected in the content model. Gaps in the content, things that they wanted to be able to put into a design but had nowhere to actually live in the content itself. Things like metadata and relationship needs, potential ways that content could be reused. Although the visual diagrams weren't like a canonical reference for it, They helped me spot those problems. Workflow diagrams did the same way, like ironing out what is the actual flow that a piece of content takes through our organization. This is actually a real diagram for a place that needed, I think, 20 different languages and legal approval for any changes. We had to figure out, okay, let's chart the process of a happy little node through that tangle. But working through this process, this isn't a content model, but it did help me figure out what changes needed to be made to the model so that it really reflected how the organization worked. Even journey maps, which I'll be honest, I find these kind of like a little baffling and a little head scratching, but I'm not directly involved in marketing. These are maps of different ways that users encounter a brand or an organization or your content. In this case, it's like someone unboxing a product. Where do they, are they curious about it? Have they just purchased it? Are they learning how to use it? Are they using social media or print manuals? And this is like a big chart that some teams will make to figure out where the pieces of stuff we have are going to show up, in what contexts are they going to be used. And those things can reveal lots of useful information as well, just like those other kinds of representations. And I'll let this go. Yeah, I think the idea here is that big picture of looking at it through other teams' eyes and bringing them into the process so that they can spot problems and identify stuff, that's a real shift from the old school, I will get up in front of a whiteboard and we're going to draw boxes and we're going to draw lines and we're going to do a content audit and figure out where all your URLs fit on this and stuff like that. But it works. And as we do, if you start doing this, one of the things that I would say is useful is, what to do with each of these artifacts as you come across them, or you find someone else working on them, or even you read an article about, some cool way of, using a new tool to suss out information about a project. With each one of these, ask, like, whose perspective is it capturing? Is it a particular department, a particular discipline or team, a particular kind of user of our system or something like that? Whose take on our system is this going to be helping me figure out? Where does it overlap with other kinds of artifacts that I've got? Like, there's a high overlap between that entity relationship diagram with all of its boxes and arrows and the spreadsheet of, different content types and all their fields. Lots of overlap, but we can also use those overlaps to figure out, okay, are there mismatches here? Are we colliding, and, do we need to resolve problems? Are we using different words for the same thing? This begins to touch on that question of language. Are we actually talking about something, but the design team calls it this, the stakeholders call it this, and the Drupal developers call it a block, because they always call it a block. Do we need to, does it reveal oversights? Things that we haven't thought of when we were looking at other artifacts. Did our journey map reveal that we haven't actually thought through localization hard enough or something like that? And finally, does what we've discovered from this particular way of looking at it mean that we need to go back and revisit some of the other things that we figured out? And using this kind of approach means we can iterate through lots of these different kinds of tools to force ourselves to see it from different angles more quickly than we probably would just trying to do our magic diagram and then march through the process and see if we encounter problems along the way. And that's a big advantage. So I'll wrap this up fairly quickly. I'm running a little bit long. I won't keep everybody from lunch, but what sort of pulls this all together, there's a book I really love called Domain-Driven Design. It's pretty nerdy. If you don't like C++, I would not recommend going and buying the whole book. But there's also a nice little pocket reference called Domain-Driven Design Reference that's just an explanation of the key concepts that's probably worth checking. Basically, the premise of the book is that collaboration between domain experts or topical experts and the people who are building systems is critical. And I think in a lot of our projects, I'd take that even further, that collaboration between like domain experts and designers and content authors and developers, all of those different teams need to be on the same page in order for things to execute properly. And then he also talks about what he calls bounded contexts, that each one of those different domains, those different teams with different ways of approaching and doing things, understanding and recognizing that they have their own way of seeing and understanding things, and that the problems and also the opportunities to refine things come when those bounded contexts bump into each other. When the work of the design team and the work of the development team overlap and have to, connect to each other, that's where to look for friction. And then finally, he talks about the value of building a shared language so that, again, when we're talking about these things with each other, the design team can use a shared, term that everyone in the organization understands. That when the stakeholders say, hey, we need to put a new promo on the website, everyone knows what promo means when we talk to each other. He says that, dealing with large, complicated models, you can do that by dividing them up into those different bounded contexts and being explicit about their relationships, rather than trying to make one intense, shared vision that everyone has, making sure that in the overlap points where communication matters, that's where most of our energy is sunk, ironing out those friction points. And then he says that in this shared language thing, he says that projects are dramatically impacted when you develop a language that flows, that you can actually use conversationally on a team to talk about what you're building or what you need and stuff like that. And that the language and the vocabulary that's built out as you start ironing out agreement on these things can actually be used to express complicated ideas about your projects. And as we do this, a lot of traditional, friction points between teams, ideally, what we start doing is ironing out like a shared vision of what it is that we're working on where we overlap. And we start being able to talk, we start spotting where the differences are and where the points of, miscommunication and confusion are with things like, so, wait, what do you call the eyebrow of an article? That's an actual example from a recent project. Turned out it was, on the print version, there's a little thing that's always at the top of the page, on every article, saying, here's where you are in the issue. Well, that's the eyebrow. And, they'd been talking for 2 weeks about how important it was that we managed to get the eyebrow on the website. Taking the time to talk through those terms can help a lot. Remember, always add an eyebrow field. No, that's not true at all. So finally, like these three questions that we've been talking through, these three big hurdles, the territory problem, the issue of different groups having a different vision of what the content is and what it means and how it's used. Using other teams' tools and approaches and techniques to refine your model and incorporate other perspectives is absolutely the best way to increase the accuracy of what you're creating. In part because no model document that you make is going to be able to capture the totality of what the content is. You're just always answering a specific set of questions. And the more angles you look at it from, the better you'll understand sort of the underlying thing that you're trying to talk about in any of those documents. And as you do that, it also helps you work towards developing that shared language, building a vocabulary that everyone in the organization is comfortable using to talk about content, to talk about the project, and to communicate about things. And the funny thing is that third problem, time, the fact that things change and drift and evolve, if that shared language that we create is actually being used, it becomes way easier to start spotting the changes. Because what you can listen for is changes in the way that people talk about the content that's being produced. If people are all on the same page and all talking about the same stuff with a shared vocabulary, noticing that they are saying different things or that a new term has emerged and is being used to talk about a particular kind of content, that is a much easier canary in the coal mine for, I think we may need to revisit the content model. We may need to update some stuff than just hoping for the best and doing like 6-month reviews and massive audits and asking, are you putting the right stuff in that field? Are you really? You know, and it becomes a more organic process, ideally. That's it. It sort of tapers off to a gentle conclusion. There's no big bang. I debated about moving the cans of cat food to the end to give it a real punch, but I figured I'd just let it end naturally. But that's, I think, this is a simple concept once we get it, but it has the potential to, I think, really improve how we approach and evolve our projects, looking at our content modeling work, our planning and our structural, organizing as an exercise in incorporating more perspectives and learning how to look at it from different angles and to communicate about that, of working towards shared understanding rather than just a particular document or deliverable. I think that has a really huge impact on the success of the projects we're working on and the longevity of the work that we have done, how long it lives on and continues to deliver value. So that's it. Thank you very much.